Jack here again. Let's go back to Chapter 7 and talk a little bit about global environmental scanning. Your book talks about doing global environmental scans to decide whether or not you should enter a particular country with your product. Some of the factors that influence whether or not a company might decide to go into a foreign country is the cultural diversity of that country, the economic considerations, and the political legal climate. So let's talk about each of those in turn. All right, so the idea behind the cultural aspects includes the idea of what their values are in their particular country, what their customs might be, symbols that they might use, and their language. So to decide whether or not to go into a country, we need to have an appreciation of the aspects of their culture compared to our culture. So an example, this might be cultural symbols, of course, the Eiffel Tower for France and the Parthenon for Greece. But there's also semiotic culture factors. Like, for instance, the number 13 is considered to be an unlucky number in the U.S. That might not be the case in other countries. An example here of someone giving us the thumbs up. Well, that's a very positive symbol in the U.S., but not always a positive symbol in other countries. Language is another issue, and so you have to be real careful when you take your marketing campaign and communicate it into a foreign language. So here we have one that says, "Quit staring at my boot" for the Mini Cooper. The Italian translation is, "Stop looking at my rear." So you have to be real careful about the unintended meanings of words. For instance, the famous Chevrolet Nova, of course, for anyone who's had even a beginning course in Spanish knows that Nova means no go. So the suggestion, of course, is to translate and then back translate to make sure that the meaning that you're trying to express is the one that is intended for that particular country. Another one is to look at the stage of economic development. We talk about three sorts of countries. We talk about developed countries like Japan, Great Britain, most of the European countries. We talk about developing countries, and many of the developing countries are countries whose economies and are still in the developmental stage. This includes many of the South American countries. It might include some of the Asian countries. And at the bottom of the pyramid are countries that are not yet really developing themselves. In some cases, this includes some of the countries in Africa and some of the countries in some corners of Asia. Another economic consideration is the economic infrastructure of each individual country in terms of their communications, your ability to transport products, their financial infrastructure in terms of our ability to finance our organization, and then distribution systems in general. Because in some countries it may be impossible for us to, or very expensive for us to enter that market because the economic infrastructure doesn't really support what we are going to need to do to be successful in that country. Another economic consideration is the consuming income and purchasing power of individuals. And this, so in some countries, their annual income is not high enough to support the purchase of U.S. goods. Another thing, of course, to consider is the currency exchange rate. As an example, the currency exchange rate between the U.S. and the euro, a year and a half ago, it was $1.30 of U.S. for 1 euro, and today it is around $1.10 for 1 euro, which means that the value of the euro and the dollar have come very close to each other when they were before very far apart. Now, the benefit of having your currency undervalued is it makes your country's goods cheaper in that country. So when the euro was $1.30, it made it very easy for U.S. companies to market into Europe because the euro bought a lot of U.S. goods because of the exchange rate. Now that the exchange rate is more even, it's much more difficult for U.S. firms to compete in Europe with the same U.S. price because the Europeans can't buy as many products with the same number of euros. And then finally, there is the other economic consideration is the cultural ethnocentricity. Ethnocentricity is the belief that one culture, typically your culture, is superior to others. Someone who's considered to be ethnocentric believes that, for instance, the French might be culturally ethnocentric and say that the French culture and the French economy and is superior to all others. You will see the U.S. Using the argument that we need to buy American made by Americans. Of course, this is referred to as consumer ethnocentricity. And then we need to think through that factor as we decide to market into another country. It's very difficult for you to market U.S. goods into a country that has a negative view about the U.S. culture and the U.S. companies. Next, we need to consider the financial and legal systems and understand how that might work. And of course, once again, the currency exchange rate. This is an economic consideration that needs to be considered, and we have a little click through here that you can see an example of that. All right, and then the last factor for the environmental scan is the political regulatory climate. This includes things like political stability and trade regulations, right? And so the political stability, it's very difficult for us to go into a country that we think might have a political overthrow, and the government might take over all of the companies that are in that particular country.